Why freedom of speech is a trap. Kierkegaard explains we live in a time where freedom of speech is hailed as sacred, almost divine. We wear it like a badge of honor, defend it like a fortress, and invoke it whenever we feel threatened, silenced, or misunderstood. And on the surface, it seems obvious why. The ability to say what we think, to express our beliefs without fear of punishment, is the cornerstone of modern democracy. It's the reason revolutions were fought. It's the reason thinkers weren't burned at the stake, or at least, not anymore. We look at countries that suppress speech, and we say, that's not freedom. That's tyranny. But what if we're wrong? What if the danger isn't in the restriction of speech, but in its illusion? What if the very thing we think liberates us is, in fact, quietly enslaving us? This is the paradox Soren Kierkegaard tried to unravel almost 2 centuries ago, and it's more relevant now than ever. Kierkegaard wasn't living in 2025, surrounded by social media, podcasts, political debates, and endless online commentary. But in a strange way, he anticipated it all. He saw the birth of the modern public sphere, the explosion of newspapers, pamphlets, and public opinion, and he was deeply suspicious. Not because he didn't value truth, but because he understood something that most of us still refuse to admit: when everyone can speak, no one listens. When every opinion is broadcast, truth becomes noise. And when we're drowning in words, we lose the one thing that makes speech meaningful: silence.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
Let's stop and think about that. Have you noticed how the more we talk, the less we seem to say? How the more we express ourselves, the more empty it feels. We post our thoughts, our feelings, our outrage, our hopes, and yet, deep down, we feel unheard. We feel invisible. We scream into the void, and the void scrolls past us. That's not freedom. That's despair. Kierkegaard called this the leveling effect of the public. When every voice is equal in volume, but unequal in depth, the result isn't liberating, it's flattening. It's not that your voice doesn't matter, it's that it drowns in a sea of voices that all sound the same. This is where Kierkegaard's genius pierces through. He argued that true speech, real, authentic speech, doesn't come from the freedom to talk. It comes from the inward responsibility to mean what you say. And that's rare, because it's terrifying. And to say something true is not to tweet it, or record it, or shout it louder than the next person. To say something true is to risk everything on it, to commit your life to it, and to become it. That's not a freedom most people want. That's a burden. And so what do we do instead? We hide behind the illusion of speech. We talk, but we never commit. We express, but we never transform. We perform sincerity, but we avoid the inward work of becoming sincere. Kierkegaard believed that most people use freedom of speech not to reveal themselves, but to escape themselves. We speak not because we have something to say, but because we're afraid of the silence that might reveal who we are without words. We fear being alone with our thoughts, so we broadcast them. We fear confronting our beliefs, so we share them. We fear becoming individuals, so we become opinions. But here's the truth: freedom of speech, without inward authenticity, becomes a mask, a trap, a way to avoid the responsibility of truly being you. So I want to ask you something. When you speak, whether it's online, in a conversation, in your mind, are you saying what you believe, or are you saying what will be liked? Are you expressing your truth, or performing a version of it that fits the algorithm? Are you using speech to reveal yourself or to hide from it? Because Kierkegaard isn't trying to take your freedom away. He's trying to show you that the real danger isn't censorship. It's simulation. It's the performance of truth without the pain of becoming truthful. It's the freedom to speak without the courage to live what you speak. And when that happens, when speech becomes divorced from inwardness, from commitment, from sacrifice, it becomes shallow. It becomes distraction. It becomes noise. And here's the kicker: noise is more dangerous than silence, because silence invites reflection. But noise doesn't give you time to think. It fills the space where your soul would speak. It gives you the feeling of expression without the risk of transformation. And so slowly, without realizing it, we become hollow. We say everything and mean nothing. We fight for the right to speak, but forget why speech matters in the first place. That's the trap Kierkegaard saw coming. And it's the trap we're in right now. We think we're free because we can say anything. But if everything is said without depth, without risk, without inwardness, what's the point? That's not freedom. That's spiritual collapse. And the worst part is, we call it progress. The age of spectacle. Why we choose visibility over truth. We live in a time where being seen is confused with being real, where visibility is mistaken for truth, where the measure of someone's worth is no longer how deeply they've reflected, but how often they're watched. This is the age of spectacle, not just in media, but in thought, in identity, in morality. And Kierkegaard saw it coming, like a prophet watching a slow-moving avalanche. He warned us that the crowd, when given the illusion of individuality, would become its own form of tyranny. Not a tyranny of suppression, but a tyranny of emptiness. And the most dangerous part is this: we willingly participate in it. In fact, we celebrate it. We choose it. Because being seen feels like being alive, even when it's killing truth in slow motion. Kierkegaard understood that the public, once it becomes a spectacle, no longer seeks truth, it seeks stimulation. And in our world, stimulation is everywhere. We scroll and scroll, not because we're searching for meaning, but because we're addicted to distraction. We consume opinions, not to be challenged, but to be entertained. We speak, not to be understood, but to be noticed. What we fear most isn't being wrong, it's being invisible. And that fear drives us to say things we don't mean, to perform identities we haven't earned, to signal virtues we don't live. We build digital personas like avatars and feed them likes, views and hashtags, hoping they'll somehow become real. But Kierkegaard reminds us, the self is not something you display. It's something you become, and becoming requires silence. It requires solitude. It requires the kind of internal struggle that doesn't look good on camera, that doesn't trend, that no one claps for. But we've traded that struggle for the comfort of visibility. We've replaced the hard work of inwardness with the cheap thrill of exposure. And in doing so, we've made ourselves more seen and less known than ever before. Ask yourself, how much of your life is lived for the gaze of others? How many of your thoughts are filtered through the lens of what will they think? How often do you speak, not from the depth of your being, but from the surface of performance? We've made our lives into stages, and we're all actors now. But unlike in theatre, the audience never leaves, and the performance never ends, and the script is always changing based on what sells today. Kierkegaard called this the despair of the aesthetic life. It's the despair of the person who lives only on the surface, who avoids the inward leap of faith by clinging to the outward mask of relevance. And here's what makes it so devastating: it feels good. It feels like freedom. The aesthetic life is not painful at first, it's intoxicating. But over time, it hollows you out. Because no matter how many people see you, if no one knows you, not even yourself, you begin to rot from the inside. And this is where freedom of speech becomes a trap. Because in the age of spectacle, you're free to say anything, but you're also expected to say something. Constantly, endlessly, loudly. Silence is punished. Reflection is mocked. Doubt is treated like weakness. And so we speak, even when we have nothing to say. We post, even when we're empty. We perform, even when we're lost. And the more we do this, the more we lose our ability to know what's true, not just in the world, but in ourselves. That's the tragedy Kierkegaard saw. Not that people would be silenced by governments, but that they would silence themselves through performance. That they would trade the difficult journey of authenticity for the easy rush of attention. That they would mistake applause for meaning and likes for love. And the deeper tragedy is this: it's happening to us right now. We are the ones Kierkegaard was warning. We are the generation drowning in speech, but starving for truth. So I ask you, what would you say if no one was watching? Who would you be if no one was clapping? What truth would you live if you weren't afraid of disappearing? Because in that silence, in that inward space, is where the real self begins to form. Not the one the world wants to see, but the one that can actually survive without it. The leap of silence. Why true speech begins where talking ends. There comes a point in every honest life where words fail. Where expression, no matter how eloquent or loud, begins to feel like a lie because it no longer captures the weight of what's within. This is the edge Kierkegaard stood on when he spoke of the leap, a moment, not of argument, but of existential rupture. A moment when the soul realizes that to truly speak, it must first fall silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from fear or repression, but the kind born from the recognition that truth is not performed, it is suffered into being. And in that moment, we are faced with the terrifying possibility that everything we've said until now may have been covering up the one thing we truly needed to express. We've been trained to believe that talking is power, and that to speak is to assert control. That if you can name something, you can master it. But Kierkegaard flips this on its head. He suggests that speech without inward transformation is empty, and worse than empty, it's deceptive. It convinces us that we've done the work simply because we've described the work, that we've changed just because we've articulated our desire to change. But that's not how truth works. Truth demands more than articulation, it demands sacrifice. It demands the kind of silence that breaks you open, the kind that leaves you trembling, alone, unmasked, with nowhere left to hide but within. This is why Kierkegaard distrusted public discourse. Not because he was against dialogue, but because most conversations are not dialogues at all, they're performances. They're rehearsals of identity, not revelations of self. We talk to be heard, to be seen, to be affirmed, but rarely do we speak to be transformed. And yet that's the only kind of speech that matters. The kind that costs you something. The kind that emerges from the abyss of silence after you've faced the full weight of your contradictions, your fears, your failures. So I ask you, when was the last time you let silence do its work? When was the last time you stopped talking, not because you had nothing to say, but because you realized that what needed to be said could only emerge after you had listened deeply to the silence within? Most of us are terrified of that stillness. We fill every gap with noise, every pause with performance. But Kierkegaard would challenge us to do the opposite, to wait, to fall quiet, to let the false self die in the silence, so that the real self might speak not with cleverness, but with truth. This is the leap of silence. It's not passive. It's not avoidance. It's an act of radical courage. Because when you stop talking, when you stop broadcasting yourself to the world, you begin to hear what's actually there. And it might not be pretty. It might be grief. It might be guilt. It might be a question you've been running from your entire life. But whatever it is, it's real, and only what is real can be redeemed. Kierkegaard believed that truth is always a paradox. It's not found in slogans or statements, but it's found in tension in the terrifying space between what we say and what we are. And to close that gap, we must go inward. We must become silent enough to see clearly, to feel fully, to name without illusion. This is not the silence of defeat, but of preparation. Because when you emerge from that silence, you don't just have something to say, you are something to say. Your life becomes the message. Your actions become the argument. Your being becomes your proof. And so the trap of freedom of speech is not that it silences us. It's that it makes us think we're speaking when we're not. It gives us the illusion of depth when we've only skimmed the surface. But the way out of that trap is not more speech, it's deeper silence. A silence that births speech worth saying. A silence that cleanses the soul of noise. A silence that makes room for truth. So the next time you're about to speak, pause. Ask yourself, am I saying this because it's true, or because I'm afraid of what the silence might reveal? And that question alone could change everything. The burden of becoming, why real freedom demands inner authority. If silence is where true speech begins, then what follows must not be noise, but authentic becoming. Kierkegaard didn't speak of freedom as a right to do whatever we please. He spoke of freedom as the terrifying responsibility to become who we truly are. And that's the part we often forget. We think freedom is the removal of limits, the breaking of chains, the absence of constraints. But Kierkegaard reminds us, the greatest chains are not outside us, they're within. The expectations we inherit, the roles we perform, the selves we pretend to be. And unless we confront those inward prisons, we will never be free, no matter how loudly we speak. To become oneself is the heaviest burden a human can carry. Not because it's impossible, but because it demands everything. It demands that we stop blaming the world for our confusion, that we stop outsourcing our identity to the crowd, that we stop hiding behind borrowed opinions, trending ideologies, and curated personalities. Kierkegaard's radical insight is that no one can become you for you. No system, no social movement, no political freedom can hand you your selfhood. That's your task, yours alone. And the moment you realize that is the moment freedom stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a burden. But it's a sacred burden. Because once you accept it, you begin to live with a different kind of authority, not the authority to dominate others, but the authority to answer to your own soul. That's the highest form of freedom, not speech without consequence, but speech that comes from a life aligned with truth. Not opinion for attention, but conviction born from suffering, solitude, and self-examination. And here's the twist. The more deeply you live from that place, the less you need to speak at all, because your life speaks. This is the paradox Kierkegaard points to again and again. The more inwardly authentic you become, the less you feel the need to broadcast it. The more you live in truth, the less you need to convince others of it. But true freedom of speech isn't about volume, it's about authority. Not the kind that comes from credentials or followers, but the kind that comes from having wrestled with yourself in the silent places and emerged with something real, something earned, something unshakable. So ask yourself, the speech you defend, the freedom you claim, the voice you use, does it come from that place? Or is it still caught in the spectacle? Still shaped by the gaze of others? Still seeking validation from a world that doesn't even know your name? Because here's the terrifying truth: you can live your whole life speaking freely and never once say something true. You can have all the rights in the world and still be spiritually enslaved. You can win every debate and still lose your soul. Freedom of speech, in the Kierkegaardian sense, is not the end goal. It's only the starting point. The real question is, what will you do with that freedom? What will you create with it? What pain will you face with it? What will you become? And becoming is the hardest thing. It's not glamorous. It won't go viral. It won't get you applause. It will break you. It will strip away every illusion you've ever held about who you are. It will demand that you die to the self that was comfortable, convenient, and false. But on the other side of that death is a freedom no one can give you and no one can take away. The freedom to live without masks, to speak without performance, to move through the world not as a product or persona, but as a person. This is why freedom of speech, without inner authority, is a trap. It tempts us to believe that expression is the same as becoming, that being heard is the same as being known, that having a voice means having a soul. But Kierkegaard challenges us to go deeper. He calls us to a freedom that cannot be legislated or posted or performed. A freedom that is won only through the slow, painful, beautiful process of becoming ourselves. And so I leave you with this: don't just fight for your right to speak. Fight for your right to mean it, to live it, to become it. That is the only freedom worth having. And no one can walk that path for you. Only you can make the leap. Only you can bear the silence. Only you can become. And once you do, your speech will no longer be free. It will be true.